want to begin by reminding you of a famous saying. It goes like this: please don't shoot the messenger just because you don't like the message. I am not responsible for the conditions that we face as a nation today, but I am not going to sugarcoat what the situation is. My guess is you already know it in your hearts and in the backs of your minds. What will the United States do? Continue its denial of what's going on? Threaten, as they have, China with war, despite the fact that China has nuclear weapons and the Russians do too, and they are now allied in good part because of the United States? Or are we going to sit down and work something out? Are we going to tell the American people, honestly, our empire is declining? The next one looks to be Chinese. Or if it isn't Chinese, it's going to be a multinational replacement for the kind of dominance that the Persians or the Dutch or the British or the Americans operated. The world is changing very fundamentally. Mr. Trump's economic proposals, whatever else you think of them, are economically incoherent. It's great advertising. I'm protecting you with my walls. It's wonderful. But when it comes now to governing, it's impossible, and it's a bad joke. And the whole world is watching. And while it's watching this bad joke unfold, the gap between the United States and the G7 on one hand, and the People's Republic of China and the BRICS on the other, deepens. The United States' effort to stop, block, undercut China have failed. Been doing it now for 15 years. Started big time under Obama. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so the question is, what? Do you keep doing it? Mr. Trump won the election because he positioned himself with dramatic gestures, the sort favored by Madison Avenue advertisers. And the two gestures were, I am the great protector. Mr. Trump understood far better than the Democrats that people feel attacked, undermined, frightened, scared, worried for themselves and their children, as well they should be. They glimpse fearfully where things are going. They want to be protected from it all. So he put himself forward as the great protector. And his two images were walls, the image of a protector. He's going to put a steel wall at the southern border to protect us against the invasion of the immigrants. And then he's going to put another wall, a tariff wall, to protect us against the evil Chinese. Very powerful images, very successful. But in terms of economics, total incoherent nonsense. We have 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. That's according to the Department of Homeland Security. We are a population of 330 million Americans. Do the math. 10 to 12 of the poorest people in the country, those immigrants, are not the explanation for the economic difficulties of this rich country of 330 million people. The very idea of that is ridiculous. An undergraduate who wrote such a thing would be called in by their teacher and told, try to think through what you're saying before you say it. If Mr. Trump now deports 5 or 10 of these 10 to 12 million immigrants, which he has threatened to do, there will be consequences. Why? Because undocumented immigrants are the most abused of our working class. An undocumented immigrant who asks for his pay on Friday afternoon and is told by his employer, sorry, I don't have the money, has no recourse. He can't go to the police. He's an undocumented immigrant. He doesn't want to get anywhere near any office of the government. He will not complain. He can't. He's like a slave. And that's how they're treated. The construction industry in this country is a major employer. If it doesn't have undocumented employees, it'll have to pay Americans. And you know what? It'll have to pay them a hell of a lot more than they're paying the terrified, undocumented immigrant. And that will mean the cost of construction will zoom up. And you know what that does? It worsens our, inflation. Mr. Trump either can't do it for that reason, or he will produce an inflation that will overnight turn him from savior to demon in the eyes of his own followers. Then there's the second wall, the tariff wall. Let me remind everyone what a tariff is. It's just a tax. It's the name given to a particular kind of tax, namely the tax charged to an American importer when that person brings something produced overseas into the United States to be sold. It means Mr. Trump, a Republican who is against taxes, is proposing an enormous tax increase. And while saying he's hitting the Chinese with a tariff, it's not the Chinese who pay for tariffs. It's Americans. The American importer will pay much more, and that person will then charge more to the consumer, you and me. And you know what that means? An inflation, which he can't have. Yet he proposes these, counting on the American people to be into denial, not to interrogate any of this, to sit there and have debates as if there's something to debate. The debate is a distraction. It's a way of not dealing with your problem because you're too frightened of letting it be debated, lest it go where it might bite you. And we are run by a community of businessmen and women in charge of our corporations, including our mass media, who are not going to do it. And our job as Americans is to stop behaving childishly in this game of thinking that the problems I've barely sketched don't have to be worried about, because we can continue to act as if we were in charge in the way we were in the 1960s and 70s. We aren't. Nothing like that. The war in Ukraine is lost. For those of you who don't keep track, is over, except for signing the documents. Russia won, Ukraine and the West lost. The war in Gaza isolates the United States. Indeed, what historians will say when they look back on this time will be that the United States undertook to isolate and neutralize the dangers after World War II. First in the Soviet Union, then in China, then in the global socialist world, nowadays in what are euphemistically called authoritarian societies. But the end result of the plan to isolate the rest of the world going through these efforts was to isolate the United States itself. We and Israel are standing all alone in that part of the world. And the Europeans, whose world is collapsed, they're economically a basket case. And you know why? What the major reason is that Europe is gone as a player? Because they relied on two things: exporting to China, which the Chinese don't need, and cheap energy from Russia, which they have turned away from. So the energy costs make a European production uncompetitive. They have to pay too much for energy, and they can't sell in China the way they once did. They're done. Germany, which used to be the engine of European growth, is now the laggard dragging it down. It really is extraordinary, folks, that what you have thought about and assumed is now over. And it takes courage, but also a sense of realism to say, now we are going to talk honestly about our situation and try to find a livable way forward. The alternative, well, I don't want to spell it out. You can figure it out for yourself, but I hope you will not hold against me that I have told you how this situation really is, rather than comforting you with more denial. But if I have failed, which I understand I may well have, then I have good news for you. If you want to wallow in denial, just turn on the radio and the television, and this evening it will all go go away as you get told that the great issues of our time are those carefully excluding everything I have told you. When you hear about China having rare earths that America wants, that's a small part of the story. The big one is the whole global economic change that has worked in the advantage of China and the disadvantage of the United States. Well, what does the United States hope to accomplish? Well, the leaders of our country, from President Trump on down, state one fact over and over again. China sells more in the United States, a lot more, than the United States sells in China, although China is an important customer of U.S. exports. But the idea is we can win the trade war because China needs us to buy its stuff more than we need China to buy ours. Now, that's true. They do, in fact, sell more. But let me explain to you why the Chinese are acting very tough, responding, not backing down, none of it. What is it they know that perhaps you don't? So let me guess and tell you. China has been, for at least a decade, carefully cultivating economic, political relationships with its allies. It has made allies. The Belt and Road Initiative, all the Chinese investments in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the BRICS Alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the 15 countries that they have brought in, including giant countries like Indonesia. China has a robust community encompassing more than half the people on this planet. That's why they're tough. They can shift and produce for those allies what the United States no longer buys. And they're doing that as I speak to you. And why does that make them strong relative to the United States? Because the United States, trying to cope with the economic costs of its declining empire, is turning on its allies and driving them away. A few weeks ago, there were elections in Canada and Australia. Two parties way behind in the polls, in the last few weeks, roared ahead and won both elections. Canada and Australia are allies of the United States. The parties that won had one basic idea that brought them from behind to win: anti-Trump, anti-tariffs. The whole world is shifting. China wins the trade war likely because of that. And the United States loses it likely because of how it's managing to not have an alliance when it needs one. And the Chinese have simply done that more. The United States suffers from a decline of its manufacturing. We're not a country, as we once were, we are told, of factories. We're a country of offices and stores, but not much factory work is still done here. We're high-tech, and factories are less high-tech. And even when we have factories, they don't have many people in them. They are automated and so forth and so on. And we are told by people who tell this story that we have to accept, we, the community, the costs of long supply chains. They can get interrupted. They can get fouled up in various ways. And so sometimes we don't have what we want on the shelves in the stores when we want it. Or sometimes a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal. Or sometimes fill in the blank. And we're likewise told that with the loss of manufacturing, we've kind of hollowed out the American economy. The middle class got lost because the middle class was workers who were in unions, who got good wages and therefore had a standard of living that they could call middle, and that with the departure of manufacturing, that middle lost its jobs. And from being a high-skilled, well-paid machine operator and then becoming a greeter at Walmart, your standard of living drops like a stone. We've all heard this story, and those stories have their grains of truth. But now I want to talk with you about the all-important why. Why did this happen? Why are there long supply chains when there didn't used to be? Why is manufacturing happening elsewhere and not in the United States, which also didn't used to be? Because that part of the story is crucial if we're ever going to undo this trouble. And by undo this trouble, I mean exactly what the last 8 or 9 presidents of the United States have said when they were running for office, and often when they were in office for those who won, namely that they were committed to bringing back manufacturing, to reshoring it, taking it from the other shore it went to, bringing it back so it repositions itself inside the United States. And in that way, President Trump is no different from Obama or Clinton or Bush or Biden. They all said it. Meanwhile, I have to tell you, in case you're wondering, that the role of manufacturing in the United States has shrunk like a straight line down across every one of those presidents, Republican, Democrat alike. So something very powerful is going on, because even when it's recognized that there are problems about it, even when people say they're against letting that continue, and let's assume that all the presidents meant it when they said they wanted to do this and were aiming and committed to do it, so what prevented any of them from doing it? And in case you're wondering, I don't think Mr. Trump's measures are going to be any more successful than were those of his predecessors. Starting in the 1970s, there was something happened that had happened a little bit earlier, but really took off in the 1970s and ever since. And that was an exodus of businesses from the United States, and above all, manufacturing businesses. They left. Why did they leave? Answer: because it was profitable for the capitalists who own and operate these businesses to move them. The jet engine, which came into its own in the 1970s, made it possible to move around the globe in a matter of hours. And that made production outside the United States much more easy to organize, to supervise, to keep track of. Likewise, the internet becomes part of our lives in the 70s and into the 80s, which means that the communication, minute by minute, with a factory in China or India or Brazil is almost equally easy to keeping an eye on it if it's across the street in New Jersey or Illinois or St. Louis, Missouri. Given the jet engine, given the internet, American employers said the following to themselves, and sometimes out loud, so economists like me could see what they were thinking. They said, "We have been fighting with the American working class for a century. The American working class has put up quite a struggle. Lots of strike, lots of unions. Our factories are the most unionized part of the American economy, and those workers have won wages that are the envy of the rest of the world." All of that was true. Imagine the profits we could make, these capitalists said to themselves, if we could move production out of the United States to places where the wages are much, much lower. Wow, we could shut down the factory in Cincinnati or Pittsburgh or Detroit or Chicago or Gary, Indiana, and move it to China. Yes, that's expensive. But if we can pay 10 cents on the dollar, 10% of the wages, that's what it was in China back then, relative to the United States, the amount of profit, we can rebuild the factory, build the factory better, automate it a bit further, latest machines, and dirt cheap workers. And the Chinese are saying, come, we'll let you set up here. We'll give you a break on your taxes a little bit. We'll encourage you. Wow. Now it's an offer you can't refuse. Still, many companies were afraid. It's sort of a shot in the dark, to go to another country, another language, another customs, and then it's communist party power as well. All that scared Americans. So it was only the most courageous companies that took one factory, shut it down, and moved it to China or India or Brazil or any of the others. But after 2 or 3 years of huge profits they made, all the companies that didn't go, that were hesitant, realized they would be competed out of existence. Those companies that had gone to China were so profitable that they could produce it there, ship it all the way back, many thousands of miles on the ocean, and still offer the output at a better price than their American competitor who didn't have to ship it anywhere. Wow. So everybody went. All the other every major American company that could do it, did do it. And manufacturing moved. But I want people to understand, no mystery about it, nothing weird or strange. The Chinese could never have made that happen. They had no way to power, no lever, nothing to make American corporations do that. The American corporations, they went because it was profitable to. And they got the profits they hoped for, which meant all the rest had to go to stay competitive. And suddenly, the trickle became a rush, became a flood in which the American manufacturing disappeared. Now, let me make sure we all understand what that meant. The consumer goods, and increasingly capital goods, machines and so on, are made in China. Then they are brought all the way back. Now, let me be clear. That costs energy. The ship needs energy to make that long voyage. And they pollute the oceans when they make the long voyage and dump all the soot that comes out of their smokestacks into the water of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. It's not good for the planet, what happened. It's not good for the oceans. It's not good for the fishing industry. It's not good for our health and the quality of the air and the water we depend on. If the people as a whole had made the decision, we would never have done it, especially now that we know what the devastation was to all the people who lost their good factory jobs, to all the families that didn't have that kind of income anymore, to all the communities that didn't have those workers. In the 1970s, Detroit had 2 million people. Today, it has 700,000 people. That's what happened to America. But why did it happen? Because it was profitable for whom? The 3% of our people who are employers in this country? Yeah, they made out well. The 10% who own 80% of the shares in our stock market? Yeah, they did well. But you and me? And can the long supply line that pollutes the ocean and wastes all that energy, is that a mystery? Not at all. That's the result of what was profitable. The companies stretched out their supply lines. Instead of having a supply line that goes from Pittsburgh to Chicago or from St. Louis to New York, easily managed on truck or train, we have an enormous global movement doing a lot of harm. We wouldn't have done it. They, the corporate elite, they did it. But now, when it gets interrupted, they want us to help pay for it. And the nonsense they say, as if this is all the fault of the Chinese, they just sat there, collected the good news that American corporations, for their own profit reasons, were making the move. Last point, China didn't empty out its manufacturing. China is where all the manufacturing went. So guess what? They don't depend on long supply lines, just as the U.S. didn't 50 years ago. And so the difficulties of long supply lines and the difficulties that we experience are not experienced in China. They organize their economy differently, and we would learn a lot if instead of waging trade wars, we sat down and taught them what they can learn from America and vice versa. We'd be a much better way to go. Trump recently cut $1 billion, that's a lot of money, from the Department of Education in its program of giving grants for school mental health programs. This was $1 billion to allow school districts across the United States to hire and put into place mental health counselors to help the schools cope with the psychological problems that every single poll we know of indicates on the rise over the recent years. He cut it. This is extraordinary. We know, for example, that the pandemic has had long-lasting, upsetting effects on people's psychology, given how all of us had to cope. The cutting out of our social connections, the anxieties about being with others, and all of that. We know that we have had a spate of school shootings that no other country comes close to matching, and that those emerge in almost every case from serious mental issues. We notice that Mr. Trump is spending an enormous extra amount of money deporting immigrants, undocumented immigrants, many of whom have spent years working in the United States, being good citizens, paying their taxes, and all the rest of it. And let me remind you, as a teacher myself, if in our schools the following has begun to happen, and it has, that police people wearing ICE outfits go into a school or a community and yank people out of neighborhoods, families, communities that they've lived and worked in for many years, you can bet it agitates the young people, losing their friends, losing their neighbors, losing you fill in the blank. Of course, we need more psychological help for our students. You know what this shows? It shows something to cut $1 billion off of that budget. And already the schools are announcing they're firing the mental health advisors, trained people who were helping students through these kinds of crises. It shows that when an empire begins to decline, as ours is, the rich and the powerful at the top hold on to what they've accumulated, which means that the cost of the decline is offloaded off of the rich and the powerful, the corporations and the top 10%, and dumped on everybody else. Firing public school psychological mental health counselors is exactly that. Wow. You know what else it shows? It shows that when you have tried to convince white people, as happens so often in America, that somehow the government favors black people, it makes it easier to get white people to support cutting the programs that they need as badly and that they use as much as black and brown people ever did. The two big items Mr. Trump's budget just announced for 25-26 involve huge increases for the Defense Department and huge increases for deporting people. The money is going to do the very things that add to the mental health problems this cutback worsens. What are we doing in a society to function in this way?